Welcome back. Today we are going to start with the first chapter from Footprints Without Feet, that is, A Triumph of Surgery by James Harriet. Now, let me briefly tell you about the author James Harriet. James Harriet was a British veterinary surgeon and writer who used his many years of experience as a veterinary surgeon to write a series of books consisting of stories about animals and their owners. Well, so you can make out, students, that he was a veterinary surgeon as well as an author, and he has written many stories about the owners and their pets. Now, moving on, let me just give you a brief introduction of the chapter and about the vet also, how he observed this particular pet whose name is Tricky, and about his mistress. James Harriet was a vet, and when he saw a hugely fat dog, he appeared like a sausage to him, though he already advised Mrs. Pumphrey, that is mistress of the dog Tricky, to cut down on the sweet things. And he knew very well that Mrs. Pumphrey is not going to obey him, and he was expecting a call which came within a few days. He very strictly told Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky needed immediate hospitalization for keeping under observation at his surgery for a fortnight. And there in the surgery, he gave him no food, no medicine, but plenty of water. Gradually, Tricky, the dog, was mixed with other dogs and started playing with him. The only result that came out was that Tricky was happy at the surgery and he came out fully healthy after a fortnight. Now, let me give you a brief character sketch of Mrs. Pumphrey. She was a very wealthy woman and loved her dog too much. She gave him some little extras between meals to build him up. That included malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks at night. She gave him a lot of food to eat, but there was no exercise. He was pampered a lot. And when he became ill, she was worried and made a frantic call to Harriet, who was a vet. Though James already gave her suggestion regarding Tricky's balanced diet, but she never followed it. Now let's begin with the reading of the chapter, A Triumph of Surgery. I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat, like a bloated sausage with a leg at each corner. His eyes, bloodshot and rheumy, stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. Now, students, as you can see in the very first paragraph, it's an autobiography, as the story is written in the first person. And the vet himself is talking about Tricky and his mistress. He was in a car and he met both of them, that is the mistress and Tricky, on the street. And with whom he has compared Tricky? Like a sausage with two huge legs coming out. And his condition is also explained here, that his eyes, that is Tricky's eyes, were bloodshot and rheumy and stared straight at it, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. That means he was not at all active. He was just moving on the street with his mistress. Now, continuing with the reading, Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain. He was so listless, Mr. Harriet. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up. Some malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. Now from this paragraph you can make out that how pampered and overfed was Tricky. His mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey, is telling the vet that he was suffering from malnutrition. You know what is malnutrition? When anyone who is lacks in some food, and she thought that as Tricky was little bit inactive, he is suffering from malnutrition, though it was reverse. He was already overfed, and so what she did, she gave him extra food in between his meals, though he was taking 3 times meals, and apart from that she was feeding him with some other food that included malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks. And again she was saying nothing much really. After feeding him with so much food, she is again saying that nothing much really. There is a stress of humor here. And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? Now these lines are spoken by the vet, as he has already advised her to cut down on the sweet things, because you all know that sugar adds to the lethargic condition of anyone. Oh, I did a bit, but he seemed to be so weak I had to relent. He does love cream cakes and chocolates, so I can't bear to refuse him. Now, what was the reply of Mrs. Pumphrey? That yes, she tried her bit, but he became weak without sugar. So she had to come back to the previous food, that was of cream cakes, chocolates, and he was so pampered that she is saying that I can't bear to refuse him whenever the dog asked for all this unhealthy food. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. So, in this paragraph, students, what the vet has talked about the little dog, that the little dog was only fault was greed. He was a greedy dog. Greedy in what sense? He never refused food whenever the food is being provided to him. So he always ready for the food any time of the day, any hour of the day or night. So that was his problem. His problem was greed. And then again, doctor asked, are you giving him plenty of exercise? Well, he has his little walks with me, as you can see, but Hodgkin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago, so there has been no ring throwing lately. Now, students, you can make out that with food, whatever food we eat, and it goes for every living being on this earth, if you are having food, you need to exercise a lot to keep yourself healthy. So the doctor asked, are you giving him plenty of exercise apart from the food? Because she was giving him plenty of food, so plenty of exercise is also required. But here again, she has this little excuse of the gardener who used to take him for exercise and other playing activities, that he was suffering from lumbago, that is some back problem. So there has been no ring throwing lately. I try to sound severe. Now, I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he's going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Now, these are the words spoken by the vet to Mrs. Pumphrey in a very stern tone, in a very strict tone for Tricky, because he wanted Tricky to be in good health. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I'm sure you're right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off, head down, along the road, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. So, Mr. Harriet observed Mrs. Pumphrey going along the street with her dog, and she was feeling determined to put the new regime, that is, the new routine, to practice immediately for her dog. I watched their progress with growing concern. Now the vet is concerned about the ill health of Tricky. He was sure that he is going to receive a call from Mrs. Pumphrey very soon related to Tricky. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. Now, students, you can make out from this para that Tricky was not only pampered by overfeeding of the food, but also in other ways, like for his wardrobe. Wardrobe is the kind of clothes that a person keeps for different occasions. So we had different clothes for different occasions, for cold weather, raincoat, and for other seasons as well. The expected call came within a few days. The expected call here, the vet was already aware that he is going to receive a call. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Now let's see what was the call by Mrs. Pumphrey, what she was talking about. She was very much concerned about Ricky's health, and what she said, Ricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes. And besides, he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting, didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. Now, as the vet was already expecting this call, and now what's the condition of the dog Tricky? That he has refused food, even his favorite food. And not only this, he is having bouts of vomiting, that is repetitive vomiting. And what he is doing, he is not at all active and is constantly lying on a rug, panting. Panting here means taking deep breaths. So Mrs. Pumphrey was very much worried. I had made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight. So vet Mr. Harriet was already pre-planned for Tricky that he is going to hospitalize Tricky for about a fortnight, that is for about 14 to 15 days, and to keep him under observation. The poor lady almost swooned. She was worried that how both of them, Tricky and she, is going to survive without seeing each other. But I took a firm line. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay, and followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings, I marched out to the car, carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. So now this time, Mr. Harriet didn't listen to Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings. Wailing seems like, she was crying. And he almost, you can say, forcibly took the little dog wrapped in a blanket. The entire staff was roused and mates rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Realizing that my car would never hold all this stuff, I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. So from this para also you can make out that Mrs. Pumphrey appointed so many people for this little dog and so much of his stuff for him because he was going out for a fortnight. And what are the things that she was stuffing into the author's car were his cushions, his day bed, his night bed, his toys, his bowls for every meal. And the vet realized that his car is going to fill with all this stuff, so he just moved away, and everybody was in tears. So not only Mrs. Pumphrey but the entire staff was in tears. Out on the road, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said. You haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. Now the vet just took away the little dog and put him on his side seat, and he was driving, and he glanced. That means he gave a look at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat. He was pathetic means when you pity someone. So he was just pitying the little animal. He patted the head with affection, and Tricky made a brave effort. Tricky definitely was aware about his vet, and he was friendly, and the poor thing just forcibly wagged his tail. Poor old lad, he said, and the vet was sure that he has some treatment for this dog. He knew what cure he is supposed to give to this poor little dog. At the surgery, the household dogs surged round me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So as he is a vet, his hospital, or you can say his surgery, was full of other dogs also. And when the vet arrived, all the dogs, as you know, it's the dog's habit that when the master comes, they all just come up to greet the master or to show affection. So when they saw that there is another dog with him, he they tried to came near Tricky, but when they saw that he is lying motionless, they thought that he is some kind of an interesting object and ignored him and just moved away. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days, I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. So the treatment is started. And what was the treatment? No food. He was given not a single bite of food. He was just surviving on water. And that was his treatment, as thought by his doctor, his vet. And for the very first day, he didn't move. And at the end of the second day, that means when the 2 days passed, he started to show some interest in his surroundings. That means now he was feeling better. And the treatment, I mean, it's such a humorous thing that the treatment was no food at all. And he was recovering. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Now, after the second day was over, Tricky came out of that box and he was immediately engulfed, means he was surrounded by Joe, that is the greyhound, that is another breed of the dog, and his friends. After rolling him over thoroughly, inspecting him, now the dogs inspected him and moved off down the garden. Now, Tricky followed them, means he gathered that much of energy now to move after those dogs, and he was moving towards the garden, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. He was still having a lot of fat in his body. At least now he is able to move. He has improved. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. That is another dog. So now we have seen Joe, Tristan. These two are there, and third one is Tricky. And many other dogs are there whose name is not given. There was the usual headlong rush followed by the sounds of high-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. Were very energetic and they were having their meal. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. So, this day also, Tricky was not provided with any food, but he licked some of the leftovers on the leftovers from the bowls. From then on, his progress was rapid. Now, after the third day, there was some progress and it was very quick. Rapid is quick. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at mealtimes and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. Now you can compare his life at Mrs. Pumphrey's house and here. He was a pampered one, and how he is, his personality is compared, his appearance, that he was like a silky little object among the shaggy crew. Now, rest of the dogs were quite shaggy and quite violent and rough, and he was like a silk, very soft and very pampered. And now he is showing some interest with other dogs as well, and he was having the time of his life. That means he was enjoying and recovering also. All right, moving on. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. Now, let's see the condition of Mrs. Pumphrey. She was obviously very much anxious about her dog, and she used to call dozen times a day for the latest happenings in her pet, how he is doing, and the vet was able to convince her that he is recovering. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. Now, Mrs. Pumphrey was passing a lot of food for her dog that included eggs and 2 dozen at a time. That means somewhere around 24. And not only that, the bottles of wine also began to arrive. And what was happening to all this food stuff? It was consumed by the doctor and his partner. It was not given to Tricky. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion. Luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. Now, so Mrs. Pumphrey was giving eggs, wine, and brandy for the dog, but do you think it was being given to the dog? No, it was consumed by Mr. Harriet and his help at his home, and they were having a gala time, enjoying all those eggs and wine and brandy. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight, felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. Now, this particular line, it was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest. What tempted Mr. Harriet to keep Tricky as a permanent guest? It was all the food stuff that was being provided for Tricky and was consumed by him. He was happy that apart from the fees that he is going to take from Mrs. Pumphrey, this was all came as a bonus, as free for him. So, but he can't keep Tricky for long. So after a fortnight, he had to go. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is it really better?" Now the day arrived when Tricky had to go back. And as soon as the vet called Mrs. Pumphrey up to take her dog back, within minutes, she came in what? 30 feet of gleaming black metal. Can you guess what we are talking about? It's about the car, that is limousine. She came in limousine. You can make out that she's a rich lady. Gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door. Chauffeur raised the driver, with uniform and all. And I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Now, her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. Now, you can visualize that she was anxiously waiting for the dog. And she asked very anxiously, "Please tell me the truth. If he is really better." She was, very anxious to meet the dog. "Yes, he's fine. There is no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him." So the vet said that you be in the car. I'm going to bring him to you. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling around and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. So the vet himself observed the changes in the dog that he brought 14 days ago. Now, at that time, the comparison can come as a question. And now his condition has been explained, that now how he is appearing. He is a hard-muscled animal and was keeping up well with the pack. He's now energetic, moving, running around. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and Tricky saw his when Tricky saw Mrs. Pumphrey, he was obviously happy to see her, and tears shone in Mrs. Pumphrey's eyes. Her lips trembled. She was so much emotionally attached with the dog that as soon as she saw him healthy and fine, the tears rolled down her cheeks and she just took him in her arms. "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." And now the last words of the chapter. This is a triumph of surgery. Mrs. Pumphrey was under this impression that the dog has been on medication and has been given some kind of surgery, because after 14 days he was completely fit and fine. But what's the actual truth, students? The actual truth is that he was not given any medicines, he was not provided with any kind of surgery. For the first 2 days, he was not provided with any food, only water, and after that, he was given lots of exercise and balanced diet. But Mrs. Pumphrey was thinking that it was a triumph of surgery, and she was all thankful to the vet, Mr. Harriet. Now, let me just give you the chapter briefly in bullets. Tricky was a small dog and was excessively loved by his mistress, Mrs. Pumphrey. And he was greedy and loved food but lacking exercise. And what's the result of these kind of things? He became fat, and Mrs. Pumphrey believed that he is lazy because he's suffering from malnutrition, but this is not true. He was not suffering from malnutrition. So Mrs. Pumphrey just used to give him little extras between meals so that he cannot be lazy. She was thinking that as he's suffering from malnutrition, she was giving him lots of in between food, and he was not provided with any of the exercise. And once he became ill and she was worried and made a frantic call to Harriet, who was a vet. Now James Harriet, as you know, he was a vet as well as the author. He already suggested her not to give her sugar, but Mrs. Pumphrey never followed it. James Harriet was a vet. He was shocked to see Tricky hugely fat like a bloated sausage. Now, with what he has compared, the sausage, and he advised her to cut down on the sweet things. He was expecting a call which came within a few days, and he told Mrs. Pumphrey that Tricky needed immediate hospitalization. And when he was under his observation in his surgery, he gave him no food, no medicine, but plenty of water. And gradually what happened? He mixed with other dogs and started playing with them. And as you know, one plays a lot, that means a lot of exercises and fun at the surgery. And the dog also enjoyed a lot. And after that, he was completely recovered and transformed into a hard-muscled dog. Now, James Harriet treated the dog without medicine or surgery. Mrs. Pumphrey was very happy and was filled with gratitude as she was thinking that it was a triumph of surgery.